So now we're ready to put it all together and do an entire significance test for proportion. So we are talking specifically about a one sample z-test for p. So we have our 4 parts: state, plan, do, conclude. So we're putting together what we learned in the first section and then what we just learned in the previous video. So remember, when you're finding your test statistic in the formula, there are 3 parts. The first part is the random condition. This condition helps ensure that the statistic minus the parameter is a good estimate for the difference between the true value of p and the null hypothesis. This is that you have a random sample. Part 2 is the large counts condition. This allows us to say that we have a normal distribution and therefore we can use z-scores. The third part is a 10% condition. The 10% condition is about sampling without replacement in a finite population to help ensure we have somewhat of an independent sample, therefore we can calculate the standard deviation. So suppose the conditions are met. Here we have the 3 possible outcomes. We find our test statistic, and then we either have a one-sided test because we have greater than or less than when it comes to our alternative hypothesis, or we have a two-sided test when we have not equals to. So let's look back at that potato chip example that we've done in the previous section. Recall that the potato chip producer we met in section 9.1 and its main supplier agreed that each shipment of potatoes must meet certain quality standards. If the producer finds convincing evidence that more than 8% of the potatoes in the shipment have blemishes, the truck will be sent away to get another load of potatoes from the supplier. Otherwise, the entire truckload will be used to make potato chips. The potato chips produced has just received a truckload. The potato chip producer has just received a truckload of potatoes from the supplier. A supervisor selects a random sample of 500 potatoes from the truck. An inspection reveals that 47 of the potatoes have blemishes. Is there convincing evidence at the alpha is 0.10 level that more than 8% of the potatoes in the shipment have blemishes? So the first part, state. We need to state the test in our hypotheses and define the parameter and the significance level. So the null hypothesis is p is equal to 0.08. The alternative is that p is greater than 0.08. P is equal to the true proportion of potatoes in the shipment with blemishes, and our alpha significance level is 0.10. Our plan is where we state the name of the test and we check the conditions. So this is a one sample z-test for a proportion. So random, we have a random sample of 500 potatoes from the shipment. 10% condition, it's reasonable to assume that 500 times 10% of all potato is less than 10% of all potatoes in the shipment. Large counts, 500 times 0.08 and 500 times 1 minus 0.08 are both greater than or equal to 10. So now we can move forward and actually calculate the test statistic and p-value. So this is the do part of the 4-step process. The sample statistic is 47 out of the 500, so 0.094. Now we move on to calculating the test statistic. You can do so by using the formula or your calculator. So using the formula, the statistic comes out to 1.15. Then when you go into the table, that becomes a p-value of 0.1251. Or using your calculator for the entire part, you get a p-value of 0.1251. So now we conclude. Because the p-value of 0.1251 is greater than alpha, which is 0.1, we fail to reject the null hypothesis. There is not convincing evidence that the true proportion of blemished potatoes in the shipment is greater than 0.08. Some things to remember. For the AP exam, when a test leads to fail to reject the decision, as in that example, be sure to interpret the result as we do not have convincing evidence for the alternative. Saying anything that sounds like you believe or might be true will lead to a loss of credit. For instance, it would be wrong to conclude there is convincing evidence that the true proportion of blemished potatoes is 0.08. And we don't write responses as text messages like FTR, the null hypothesis. Also, you can use your calculator to carry out the mechanics of a significance test on the exam. but there's risk involved. If you give just the calculator answer with no work, and one or more of your values are incorrect, you probably will get no credit for that do step of the process. If you opt for the calculator only method, be sure to name the procedure. So this was the one sample z-test for a proportion, and to report the standardized statistic and the p-value.